remember. You see, that was probably before you left.
Right, Flibby, go on.
Let's do. Flibby says her bit. You say how you don't remember any night.
Okay.
And
Joey says she can't remember because she had brain damage.
We can. We'll...
So this is the beginning of the earliest we know about the Payne family.
This is the French connection. Sophia Plaskett and her brother. They were wine importers. Their father was wine importers, and he had a house at the end of Cork Street in Compton. Is it called Compton Road?
London.
In London, but it's near Cork Street. It's a rather lovely house. Our great-great-grandparents of our grandmother, Florence Payne, who became Johnson. Does that sound all right? Have you got my best profile?
That's good.
This is our great-grandfather, Mr. Payne, and his wife, Florence.
And here are all their siblings, that there were actually 2 marriages. But down at the end here, we have Florence, who is our grandmother, and this is her brother Aubrey, who she loved dearly, who is obviously the tie-up with Tessa and Aunt Joan and Busy.
She used to kick him, didn't she?
But they...
She did. She was always saying, I always kick my brothers, she said.
She kicked me and then sent me to an institution.
Oh,
That's why she's so odd.
What do you mean?
She was wonderful. When
Boarding school. She paid for me to be put away.
This is Florence Payne, who went out to Rhodesia at the end of the 19th century with her sister to look after and housekeep for their 2 brothers who were already living in Rhodesia. And ultimately, the sister married one of the brothers' partners, who was called Clive Pusey, and Granny then met George Johnson, who became our grandfather. And
Go on.
what?
Go on, talk about
And
it.
he started the great firm of Johnson and Fletcher.
He came from Norfolk.
He came from Norfolk, but with a weak chest. That's why he was sent, wasn't it? Because he had a weak chest, like
he
Rhodes.
was an engineer.
And he was an engineer, and he did lighting, you say, and
He went.
mining
He
engineering.
did the lighting at Kimberley, the street lighting apparently at Kimberley,
Really?
and then he heard that actually Southern Rhodesia was the place to be if you were going anywhere. So he climbed in an ox wagon and off he went.
So it's Granny and Grandpa and Mr. Fletcher, Johnson, obviously George Johnson, and Mr. Fletcher created Johnson and Fletcher, which was an engineering firm, and it was started by Grandpa and the Fletchers. They did very well. Yeah, it was absolutely superb. Yeah, and they imported timber from the Balkans, I think, or somewhere.
They used to come on leave every year to England, and you'd come on the ship, you see, and then you came to England and stayed for about 3 months. Well, they went up to Scotland, to Skye. This is getting onto the ferry, look, going to Skye. That's the ferry. That's Granny.
And Granny filmed this?
I should think so, yes.
She was a great filmer. Now she kept her hats on, these long pins, which I was quite convinced went right through her head, but apparently they only went through her
Hat
hair.
pins.
You see, we weren't allowed to talk about out there.
Oh, it's a very little fish.
They'd say, no, we're out there, that's home.
Oh, got it, well done.
Did she get one?
A very little one.
Sardines,
Trousers. This is a very
Well, I
little
read
picture,
that, you see.
probably a passport photograph of our granny, who was known as Dolly. But you wouldn't recognise her because she always wore a hat, usually with stuffed birds and nests and things in it, but very flamboyant hats.
George and Dolly are married and have 3
Sons.
sons and 1 daughter.
Dick,
Brian and Miles. That is Miles Binky, Mum's younger brother, who was shot down in the war, the Second War. He flew an aeroplane. And then Jean, who was our mother, and she
brought up the rear, and she was a spoilt little thing, we think. And this is a little portrait of her. And apparently she had mumps at the time when it was taken, and she was always told by her mother that she was very plain, which is exactly what happened to me when I had my haircut, and I am Joey. So very plain. So you must be very nice.
But she was so spoiled that she was sent to France aged 10, but saved by a doctor who said she had an enlarged heart, so she never got to France. And she was stuffed. She was.
Did she have an enlarged heart?
Well, yes. The doctor said, I think he just was being kind, so she didn't have to be sent to France.
And she was born in 1914. Just to put us.
Okay,
but she never. And then she was schooled in Paris.
But now we're going to flip over to the Mills side, and here we have William Mills and Agnes, both Millses, first cousins. They are our grandparents.
Our father's father.
So away they went and had quite a few children. They had 8 in all, and this is our father, who was born, Charles Stewart, who was born in 1904, which gives you a rough idea of the dates. Well, this is obviously Agnes. This is
mother of all.
Our grandmother, mother of all.
This is the Priory at Swanley, Kent, and there is Eliza, I think she was called, the nanny, with some of the children in the garden.
Eliza, the nanny, with
they probably ran out of hats, didn't they, do you think?
Siblings.
Probably did, yes. And they would have been having a riot, because they were terribly, they were
baby
always funny. Here's our father, Charles, when he was about 19, probably a subaltern.
Probably when Grandma fell in love with him, I should think. Wouldn't you?
Oh, he was much older than that when Grandma met him.
Yes, she was.
Oh, he was.
Yes.
He was in his
30s, Joe.
Yeah, very
he was only 19 there.
It's very beautiful.
And then there's his parents, our grandparents, William and Agnes, when they were at.
They would have been down in Dawlish.
Did they live in Dawlish for a time?
This is our mother, Jean, being presented at court in 1936. It means that any young girl would be presented to the royal family, to the Queen or whoever it was, and there'd be a garden party, and so everybody, and that made you a debutante.
But her mother had to present her,
yes.
Who had been presented. It was
or your sister or a cousin,
anyone.
Anybody, but the person before had to have been presented, and it just sort of showed that you were somebody.
It was the court circular.
She was actually 22.
Yeah.
She was 22.
She was 22.
So
there's Grandpa and Granny.
Wow, that's amazing.
Our father, Charles, in the army, in the Essex Regiment, had the options of 2 postings. We're not sure where the first one was, but the second one was Rhodesia. He wanted to apply for them both, but could only apply for one. So he took a coin and tossed it, and Rhodesia came up heads. So he was posted out to Bulawayo, and there he met in the social whirl Jean Johnson. They were very attracted to each other, but he was then posted back to England.
She thought he was an alcoholic and thought she'd look after him. Right. And discovered he wasn't. A disappointment, I think.
She met him playing polo.
Did
he was playing polo. He looked very glamorous, yes.
Right.
On the old Charger, because he never had polo ponies.
Anyway, he was then posted back to England, and he went to say goodbye to her, I believe, and she said, well, what about me? I'm coming too. So they got married at a very short notice. And their wedding cake was a sponge with one piece cut out of it.
And she wore her best frock.
And she wore her best frock.
That's the only picture of the wedding.
Our mother and father getting married.
29th of April 1940.
Granny with the white thing on her hat.
Grandpa.
And their honeymoon was the troop ship back to England through war-torn waters.
And she
back
still
to
called
England.
him Captain Mills because she hadn't learnt what his first name was yet.
She probably didn't want to call him Nutty.
Probably didn't want to call him Nutty or Chimp or something.
She said that kissing a man without a moustache was like eating an egg without salt. I believe.
Definitely. Never tried it.
At some time, probably in Rhodesia, he and I think Mum had one as well. They had tame bush babies. Bush babies, not my babies.
Bush babies.
Yes, which were very tame, and he would spend the day, because they were nocturnal, in his filing cabinet or in his drawer in his desk, and at night would sleep with him as well, but probably jumping around as well. But he'd wake up in the morning and then go, dear, I've squashed it. And then it would sort of plop up like a cartoon figure. Betty was married to Monty Crocker, who was a brother officer of our father, Charles. So they were away in the war, and our mother, Jean, lived in Cirencester. It was a farm, and they had a very nice war with chickens and
And
Jersey
a Guernsey
cows,
herd. Very,
Guernsey
very,
herd,
yeah.
which would have been special Guernseys, wouldn't they? And that's where Frank and Peter and Joe were born, in Cirencester.
Who are Frank and Peter?
Frank and Peter Crocker.
Her boys, Frank and Peter, and Jean's daughter, Joanna. Joanna.
And that was 1942.
Flibby, do you want to do next
No,
game?
it's you.
Judith, Caroline.
Look, I could hold this up because there
And then
you are
Flibby
as
with
well.
fat arms. Now I've got fat arms and you've got thin ones. It's so unfair.
I'm going to make a quiche.
Because I was two. You're not going to
Can
make
you?
a quiche.
I am. I'm going to put the filling in. So will you do these? Okay?
While you do your quiche.
Yes. Just pretend I'm here and talk to me. Okay? While you do that.
And then we can airbrush you in later, Joe. Can we help with the quiche? In 1945, Judith Caroline was born. And there she is, looking quite lovely. That's really late on though, Flibby. I was born in the White Cottage in England, in Amport, in Hampshire. But before Felicity was born, I had been to Rhodesia, and then I'd come back to the White Cottage, but then we moved to Ashley Copse. Then we all went to Egypt.
That's
There he
fine.
is.
Yes, sorry.
This is what they did in the army in those
This is
days.
Slade.
It would be at the time, I think, of the partition of India and Pakistan, which would be about 1947, wouldn't it?
He's doing dressage.
That's Papa. No potatoes.
Oh,
Oops! We always loved that bit.
It's Starlight.
Oh, look.
he's doing a traverse.
Wow! Woohoo!
Is that Traverse?
Look at that.
The first time I met him, I was 18 months old. I had moved continents 3 times and had gone to 4 different schools before I was 8. Well, Granny paid for me to be sent away to, because I was such a bother. I asked questions, she hated them.
That's Grandmother.
Skip-
Frisky
skipping-
amongst the sisal.
But you might have been conceived then.
Conceived
This is
there.
her being conceived. off stage, obviously.
No wonder she was feeling so frisky. Pari was in India and in the army, so that's why we were
At the end of the war.
at the end of the war. They were sent to live with Granny because they didn't know what else to do with them.
Well, Grandma would have taken a ship to get to India, which might have taken, it could have taken 6 weeks. And then she would, if you weren't there, she would stay for a few months, I think. And then come all the way back again.
There was
It
absolutely
wasn't-
no worry if she went or not, because as long as Nanny was there, we were quite happy.
That's all that was solid in our life was Nanny. Mothers just came and went. You didn't notice.
But Nanny wasn't particularly dishing out hugs.
No, but she was always there.
Always there, and
She hugged Flibby.
we had
She
a very,
liked-
very strict routine, and that's what life was.
You were left with Granny.
Yes, because that's when Grandpa died and he was in a puddle of blood. My vision of death, which it was.
Judith.
He wasn't at all. It was like,
You
in my
just
head, I knew death was about blood, and Grandpa had died. Well, I'd never seen him nearer than down the end of the
No.
sitting room when we were presented in the afternoon.
Yes.
And he
in
used
the
to
Robbie
say,
of Oil.
in the robbed me of oil, and he used to say, noses in the cups again, as we drank our milk or orange juice. And then he said, right, take them away. And then when he died, I thought death, right. So I knew about death. So I had this vision, I could draw it now. He was lying on a bed. The edges were just turned up. I was always practical. And there was a 2-inch puddle of blood, because you had to have blood and death. They had to be connected. And if I'd been there, I would have put my finger in and sort of thought, oh, is that really what blood's like? You know, just interested. I didn't mind. I mean, he wasn't
What did he die?
important. Just death, I think, really. But then we have this baby.
Then you have the baby.
There's that adorable
1948
1948 Felicity Ann,
was born.
and I was 3 then. There's
Jay was
Felicity Ann in the same frock as Judith Caroline, the same sort of age. Note how her arms fill up,
Somewhat fatter.
but now they're thinner.
Oh,
That's
look
me
at
with my
that!
sausage.
It's you two, aren't you? Sweet little girls. Of those dreadful swimming costumes which cut
Which
you
when
around
you
the leg.
stood up, they filled up with water. There's Joanna. Oh, gosh. And you were always cantering on a stick. There's me. When we lived in Egypt, we put socks on the end of those sticks, stuffed with probably straw, and made ears, and then put them with their heads over the fence like that. And we were quite convinced, well, at least I was, that the people walking down the lane would think they were real horses. We cantered everywhere. Even Mum cantered. We saw a picture of her cantering. Everyone cantered everywhere. We were horses. I was a pony until I was about 14, probably. From a different farm.
I'm a jolly nice big sister.
You were nice, Jo. You were very nice. You had to take so much
I had to
responsibility.
wear boots all the time.
To correct your legs. They were all squiffy. After the flight out of Egypt, we lived with Granny at the house which she and Grandpa had built in the early days and where Grandma was brought up, and we lived there because in Bulawayo, because Father had remained to sort out Egypt, and
they decided it was better for us all to be on the same continent, so that when our father got a pass or leave, he could then climb on a military aircraft and come down to visit us. And while he was there, it was such a treat to see him that I remember us all following him around like little ducklings.
Mum came to and fro India, but mostly we were with Nanny. There's Nanny on board ship, hiding in the shadows. I was then 7 when we went to Egypt. We then had to fly out of Egypt because of the Farouk was deposed. And I'd been to school I'd been at school in England before that. I went to school in Egypt, went by ship to South Africa to stay with Granny, who lived in Rhodesia, and went to school there, and then came back to England and was sent back to Rookwood again, and then I was 8, and then I went to Great Oaks. We went to Hamana, South Africa from Rhodesia, and all my memories are of being in trains, wonderful Pullman trains, in sleepers. Going all I knew was great ships with bunks, wonderful Pullman carriages going in trains, and then more ships, and then eventually airplanes. 1951, Philippi says, Farouk was deposed. We had to flee out of Egypt in the night in a great lorry and get on a ship and go all the way down through, and that was a marvellous journey. Different ships.
Mombasa, was it?
All the way to Barra, via Aden and Mombasa and Mauritius. Oh, it was brilliant. But George on the ship was one of the sort of officials on the ship.
And was he?
He fancied Mum like mad, and I've got all the letters that he wrote her, and she kept him sort of quietly, can't quite do this, George. But our father was away. He was stuck in Egypt, wasn't he?
He was
tidying up the mess.
Because Grandpa at that time had been posted to Egypt. It was his last army posting.
And he had to take that posting because Nanny, Beatrice Banyard Smith, insisted on a hot posting. Otherwise it would have been somewhere cold. So she said, no, we must. Nanny liked hot climates. Well, they asked her politely probably and said, Nanny, we can either go perhaps to Germany or somewhere like that, or Egypt. Oh, Egypt. So Pari had to take what he was offered in the way in the army, looking after a prison in the desert in Egypt, in the canal zone. And Mum had an office job.
It was the only time Mum worked, wasn't it?
It's the only job she's ever
It's the
had,
only
official
job.
job.
She apparently worked for as a secretary to one of the officers, but we believe it was her only paid job in her life. But we believe that she lost the job because the officer got fed up with his grammar and spelling being corrected by grammar.
This is in Bullaware at Norfolk House. There's Granny in her hat. There's Nanny Banyard Smith, Brian, her son, and his wife,
Pleasance.
There's the twins, Tim and Miles. That's, I think, that's me, probably making a face. And there's Flibby when she was sweet. In a pink frock. She was always sweet and had a pink frock.
What have I got on my head?
Probably a budgie. Most people had budgies on their heads. Look, there's a budgie. And me
There's a
showing off.
budgie.
And you with Simba. All the dogs were called Simba. And all the
Which
cats were
means
called
love.
Witsy.
Yes.
And we had a cat called Whitson later. And there's Ples with the twins.
So
And
Ples is your aunt.
Aunt
Yes,
by marriage,
because
yes.
she married Brian, who was Granny's second son. There was Dick Brian and Binky Miles, who was shot down in Greece. This is us in Granny's house, Norfolk House, which had been built when they first went there. And we lived there on the same continent as our father, who'd stayed in Egypt.
These are photographs,
Oh, not my
Johno,
drinking.
of Ashley Copse, which was the house that the parents bought before we went to Egypt, but where we lived when we returned in 1953 up until after Joey and Christopher were married in 1967 about.
When we came back from Africa, we went to bed before it was light, having been used to the dark coming on at 6 o'clock in Africa. We got up when it was light, and so I didn't realise they had night in England.
It was a very happy place. We had lots of space to play, and we had horses and all these
Doggies.
sort of things. And where you can see in the pictures. And then Granny decided she'd got a daughter and came back from Africa, and so she came with darling Marjorie, who was her carer. Granny had Alzheimer's.
She got too bad and needed more attention, came to live with us in England, and we took in Marjorie to look after her. She was in love with Grandpa, Marjorie was. And then she wore a lovely purple dress with a belt, and she used to secrete things down her front. Everything went
Not
down.
Marjorie, Granny.
No, Granny, yes.
She was a kleptomaniac.
She had to have a belt. I was telling Tim the other day she had to have a belt or everything would have slipped down. Mum took her very specially because there was someone there to have lunch with Aunt Joan.
Yes.
And she watched her like a hawk because Aunt Joan had very beautiful Bristol wine glasses which she didn't want Granny to pinch. And anyway, on the way home they called in at the chiropodist for Granny's feet to be done. And as they were sitting there, Granny sort of started delving.
Excavating.
And she said, "Oh, what's this? Isn't this beautiful?" And she had Aunt Joan's Georgian silver mustard pot with the mustard in and the spoon. And the chiropodist was rather surprised.
But she was never bad-tempered. She
Oh,
was
she
always
was
very
lovely.
sweet.
You
and
could
she
make
used
her
to-
laugh. That was the secret, and it
But
always
the
is
great,
the secret.
I mean, Joey, you got your sainthood then because
She
you
used to
were.
lean over me while I was sewing.
But you were sewing at home.
And if you went to the loo, she put all your sewing down
No, it wasn't when she went to the loo, it was when she went to put a bet on,
on the telephone. Oh, golly, you got the brunt of it because you were there, of course. You lived there to save up for your wedding.
Oh, Granny, do you think you've got a pair of scissors? Oh, I'll just have a look, she'd say.
Granny, have you got?
Do you think you've got a
You've got a
cat?
petticoat and a pattern and a whole lot of...
like playing Happy Families, isn't it?
But do you remember
Have you got
Marjorie
Mr. Bun, the baker's son?
And Marjorie said, "Oh, come on, Lady Johnson," and try and pull it away from her. And you had to just say,
The best person was Nidge. He strung her along.
"Oh,
She was
all
his,
your
she was
boyfriends were
her
sweet."
tall guy. He was absolutely marvellous. And he said, now come on, he said, come and tell me about your brothers.
Yeah, but she knew all about him.
They
That's
climbed
John.
trees. And
My brothers, I had,
she used to climb
and then
trees,
I'd do
didn't she?
Ron Baker.